investigation regarding the environment at the Elks Theater has been completed, and as a result of that, the former manager of the Elks Theater has been transferred, and the Elks Theater has been placed in Lori Hadley's charge, Assistant City Manager. The remaining investigation is being concluded, and it has to do with the operating conditions of the Elks Theater, complaints that were received about things that were going on at the Elks Theater after the departure of the employees, and it's being concluded. It should be concluded next week.
So the investigation concerning City Administrative Services Director Mick Finnick is ongoing with regard to the Elks Theater?
To some extent, it's ongoing because we're looking into the entire operations of the Elks Theater, all the complaints. We've had complaints from citizens about events that were, not being advertised, or events that were calls that were not being returned, complaints about the operations of the theater. As we've going through the documents and the computer programs and everything else, we've discovered a lot of these complaints, and we're addressing the number of complaints that we have there. So that's part of the investigation, and to some extent that goes to the management of the theater, how it was being run, how it was being operated by Mrs. Castaneda, and then obviously the oversight of that issue is something that we're looking into as well.
Have Mr. Finnick's duties with the city been curtailed in any other manner?
The only thing I'm aware of at this point in time is that the transfer of the Elks Theater management has occurred. And again, I think what's going on right now is the city management is waiting, and it's our normal process, they're waiting for the completion of our report. Once we do that, once we complete the report from my department, the normal process is it goes to the HR director, who reviews that. We'll meet with the city manager, and they'll discuss whatever appropriate personnel action might follow at that point in time. Now I can kind of put my former prosecutor hat on and tell you that I think it's probably going to be about another week or so. It may take a little less time, but I think right now our county attorney's office would probably take 3 or 4 weeks if they just got a report, depending on the charging. Some of the reports take longer. I do know from my experience as a prosecutor that fraud cases and theft cases that involve a lot of different fact issues and take a little bit longer to charge. And sometimes they'll ask for additional follow-up from the investigation. I used to do that when I was a prosecutor, so I would say another week or 2 would be reasonable.
If the Mojave County Attorney decides to press charges, will she have to be arrested again and put on bail again and go through all that process one more time?
The normal process would be they would issue the charges and they would go through a grand jury at some point in time. And to answer your question, yes, the judge would decide once the charges, are done, whether there would be if there's an arrest, there may be a direct charge, and that person may be brought directly in front of the court, who then determines what the conditions of release are. So it may involve a direct appearance as opposed to an arrest, custody situation, and then determination by the judge. Okay. It could go either way.
First of all, some of the comments and stuff that I've seen almost border on what I would consider slander. Is the city going to do anything about that?
I haven't spent a lot of time reading the blogs, and maybe I should, so I can't really comment on slander. If they're printed, it's going to be libel. Slander is verbal, so if you're talking about libel law, if things are malicious and they're not true, they can be either slanderous if it's said verbally, or they can be libelous. Certainly, accusations that are, person knows are false and knowingly publishing those and falsely publishing those things. And, in the case of public officials, if those are done maliciously, those would be potentially libelous comments.
Kind of detail what the city council is supposed to do regarding personnel and what the city management is supposed to do, because it's my understanding they're very different roles.
They are, and I can explain a little bit about the way government. We've got a mayor, a manager, a council form of government. The city manager is in charge of the administrative process of the city and the employment matters in the city. City council has some ability to look into things under our city charter, the right of inquiry they have. So the council's role is to look into things, but the city manager is the person who is in charge of making the hard personnel decisions with respect to the employees, the department heads, and most of the city employees. There are 4 city employees that respond directly to the council. City manager being one of those, the city clerk's another, myself as the city attorney, and then lastly the city magistrate. They're all appointed by the city council, and they function directly underneath the city council. So in the case of a personnel matter involving, for example, the theater manager of the Elks Theater or the administrator of that department, those fall under the city manager and under the personnel procedures under the HR department in terms of providing HR advice and dealing with employment matters. That's the chain of command for that.
So the council really has nothing to do, the council or the mayor really has nothing to do with the personnel issues over at the Elks Theater?
No, they're personnel issues. They have the ability to confer with myself, with the city manager, with the city clerk. We work directly under them. We serve underneath the city council. But as far as the administrative staff members, the council has the right to know what's going on, and certainly our council does try to keep involved in as many things working with the city as they can. Obviously, we've got a lot of different things going on at any given time. But they stay involved from a policymaker standpoint. Council makes the policy, city manager and the department heads and the departments execute the policy of the city council. But as far as direct involvement, and this is a good example of the case, the city council is aware of the facts, but as far as getting directly involved in the day-to-day nuances or the employment matters, they don't do that. It's done through the city manager or the city department heads.
And it's my understanding that actually the council was instructed not to have personal contact with the people involved regarding this while the investigation was undergoing.
I don't know if instructed is the right word. The council is aware that their role is a policymaker, and they know that they don't get involved in direct, individual employment matters, other than looking into them, other than looking into the facts and finding out what's going on, which they do. They don't get involved directly in employment, day-to-day employment matters. They just don't do that.
So if any of them were asked to speak with Dawn Castaneda or her husband directly, that would have been almost inappropriate under these circumstances?
It's council members in the city of Prescott have an open door policy. They'll speak to almost anyone, anytime about anything. However, when it gets to be involving employment matters that the city's involved with, generally what happens is they defer to the department heads and to the city manager on day-to-day operations and employment matters. And in this particular case, the investigation on the employment matter was assigned to my department, and I work under a different chain of command, and so we have a detective that does the civil investigation for the employment matters. And so we assigned our detective to get to all the facts of the case and interview everybody, and we've done that. Then the conclusions and findings and other information are forwarded to the department's HR, Human Resources Department gets involved, and then it goes through the chain of command, and then they make the employment decisions, whatever has to happen as far as that's concerned.
And to your knowledge, have any of the council members had direct contact with the members that quit since they quit?
I don't believe any council member has had any kind of direct contact whatsoever. I'm not aware of any contact. In fact, the council members that I've spoken with or that I'm aware of, including the mayor, have not had any contact. And I think they know it's a personnel investigation and generally would not under normal circumstances anyway. And I'm sure they have.
And another thing, I've heard it mentioned that Dawn Castaneda was fired. Is that an accurate description of her employment termination?
No. There were Dawn Castaneda and 3 other employees who were what we call part-time temporary employees, resigned from the Elks Theater, alleging, as you know, certain workplace violations that they were concerned about. After they resigned, we took the resignation letters. We conducted an investigation into those allegations. I say we, my department, and my detective investigator conducted that investigation to find out what the facts were. Those employees were contacted by the city, and they were placed on what's called paid administrative leave, which is what we generally do when we're investigating personnel matters. So even after they resigned, we agreed to pay them pending the results of looking into what their complaints were. Once that happened, the management of the Elks Theater was changed. Those employees were given an opportunity to return to work. They asked for an extension of time for several days, which we gave them, and they asked information about who the Elks Theater was going to be managed by. We responded to that request, giving them the additional time, responding to some of the questions. And some of the issues that they raised were new and had not been raised before. So we addressed those as best we could, asked them to come back to work, gave them a deadline to do that. They then, on the eve of the deadline, asked for additional time. We said, we could not continue to pay them. We had concluded our investigation, and at that point in time, we deemed their resignation to be final. So it's not true that we fired them. That didn't happen. All of them really resigned, and their resignations, we kind of suspended their resignations in a way because we paid them so that we could look into what they were saying. So during the time we were looking into their allegations, which were after the resignation, they were paid by the city, but they did resign.
It seems like some of the oversight of the money in the credit cards and all of that was a little loosey-goosey here. Are there new procedures being put into place to make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen in the future?
Yes. First of all, the city had the big event going on, the gala, and there were a number of things that were coming to management's concerns during the several months prior to the resignation, and there was a lot of focus on contracts, where those contracts were in the Elks Theater, what was going on in terms of the operations. A lot of the charges happened just before the gala. There were expenses, in terms of the remodeling and the celebration event and those kinds of things. And so, and normally what happens is there is a review every month, so those would have come a month after the gala. So that was ongoing. So we have a fairly good procedure in place. It's fair to say that the results of this investigation are definitely, we're going to tighten those operations as much as we can. And there have already been changes that have been made in the process, and also the administration.
If you do find that Mick created a hostile work environment, which is what the accusation was, that there would be any kind of charges against him?
I don't know if are you talking civil charges, employment investigation. It's part of the employment investigation is to get all the facts and bring them to the manager's attention to see what needs to get done. Interim step has been to change the management of the Elks Theater to prevent any kind of issues from arising, and change the environment of the Elks Theater so that when we complete the investigation, we start with kind of a clean slate in the Elks Theater. It may be at that point in time, once the investigation is complete and the management's reviewed, that they may take appropriate action in personnel matters, and that's normally what happens. They normally want to get all the facts in place before they make a decision. The city has a strong policy. It has a strong workplace complaint policy. We have procedures in place. If the information that these people resigned under had been brought to the city's attention prior to the resignation, we would have looked into it. We would have done an investigation. We would have gotten to the facts of it. And that's normally what we do. We have a pretty good process in place right now.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that the city was not aware that some of these issues might have been going on, that Don had not made any complaints regarding your supervisor in the past, that as far as the city knows, that this was a whole new discussion?
The city wasn't aware that there were any of these allegations going on until the employees resigned and put them in their letters. At that point in time, we conducted an investigation into them, and that's the soonest we could have done it. If they had been brought to our attention earlier, and a lot of people do, we do investigations as soon as we get the information. Now, one of the things that needs to be real clear in this particular case is that we're dealing with the Elks, the allegations these employees made, and that was the first part of the investigation, is to find the facts of that. And that's a whole separate issue. It's totally separate and apart from whether or not city property was taken. The fact that you have complaints against a supervisor doesn't justify stealing or doesn't justify fraud. So those are two very distinct things. But it doesn't mean that the city's not going to look into the allegations of the employees, and we handled that separately and looked into those matters and took the interim action, and are going to final that action as well.